Closed. So we're ready to start. Thank you for coming along. Good afternoon. There we go. It's the last day of sessions. I'm sure you're pleased about that. It's a long week for a lot of people. It's lots of information to consume about the new technology, getting up to speed on all of our stuff. And in this session, I wanted to give you a bit of an insight into what I feel are some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses across both the Hyper-V and the VMware-based private clouds. My name's Matt McSpirit. I'm a technical product manager in the Hyper-V team at Microsoft based in Redmond. And like I say, this session is aiming just to give you that broad look at some of those key technologies. If you've got VMware in your environment, what are the technologies on the Microsoft side that line up? If you've got Microsoft stuff, what are VMware doing that competes in that space? And we'll look at those technologies across a number of different areas. But this is a two-part series. This is part 2. So if you missed the first part, it'll be available online. And in that first part, we really focused on the hypervisor. So comparing and contrasting some of the key capabilities in both vSphere and ESXi specifically, and the Hyper-V and Hyper-V server layer of Windows Server. We didn't really explore in much detail some of the upper levels of management that either wrap a Hyper-V with System Center or that wrap a vSphere, some of the new stuff in the vCops management, some of the vCloud automation stuff that's now in their portfolio. So we're going to look at all of those kind of things in this session, where we look at private cloud. I'll just wait for the train to go past. Here we go. So, private cloud technologies. What are the kind of things we're going to be looking at? What are the kind of key capabilities and key technologies on either side? Well, at that hypervisor level, we discussed this the other day, and we're not going to spend any more time comparing and contrasting. But both Microsoft with Windows Server 2012 and Hyper-V and VMware with vSphere have a phenomenal set of technologies now for you to virtualize your workloads. And we think we're both at this situation now in the industry where we've both got great offerings. VMware have been in the market a little bit longer, a little bit more mature, but both Hyper-V and vSphere will provide the platform to enable you to virtualize practically any workload now. On top of that, for VM management specifically, many of you who've got vSphere, vCenter is a no-brainer. It's a have to have it to manage it. It's pivotal. It's central to managing that vSphere infrastructure. Whereas with VMM, a lot of the capabilities, a lot of the features, you don't actually need VMM. It's just in Hyper-V. I can do it if I'm a smaller environment. I can use the inbox tools in Windows to manage Hyper-V. But as soon as I want to start to move towards more clever ways of deploying virtual machines, more intelligence, then I need to start to introduce Virtual Machine Manager. But VMM, calling it and positioning it as VM management is almost underselling it now. Because if you've seen VMM throughout this TechEd week, you'll see that it's now managing storage and networking and a lot of the more fabric elements than just managing VMs. So it's becoming more of a cloud and infrastructure manager than just virtual machines. But that's the best way to position it side by side with vCenter if you've come in from that VMware side. But then when we start to think about private cloud and cloud in general, we're starting to think in different ways. We don't want to give necessarily everybody who needs virtualized infrastructure access to our vCenter or access to our VMM server, because there's a little bit too much power for those kind of users to use to deploy their own stuff. We want to provide a self-service experience that's tailored, that's slimmed down, just presents them with the key functionality they need, and we do that through App Controller. And we'll see how easy and intuitive that interface is in shortly when we start to look at some demos. But on the VMware side, VMware for a while now have had in market vCloud Director. Now, if you compare these on paper, they're doing similar things. They're providing that portal for end users, for application owners to consume virtualized infrastructure and deploy new VMs from templates and that kind of stuff. But vCloud Director does have a lot of more granularity up front for the end user than App Controller does. App Controller is aimed very squarely at that simple access, log in with your AD credentials, access the stuff that you've been given access to, deploy new VMs from templates. Don't worry about provisioning new virtualized networks and all of that stuff, because that stuff's done in VMM by the admin. So we're just positioning it that way. There's more of a blend when you think about vCloud Director and vCenter Server, because vCloud Director is enabling you to deploy things like networks and so on. So it's a little bit more complex. Then we think about monitoring. When we're deploying our apps and our services, whether you internally or you're running your IT infrastructure, you've got to provide services to those end users, those application owners. Do you want to provide, in addition, a level of insight into those workloads that are running on your stuff? And if so, you're going to need monitoring tools that help you get that visibility. And on the Microsoft side, for a long time, Ops Manager's been in the market. and providing that granular view of the complete metal to application stack, right down to the power supplies and the fans in the chassis, right down to the lines of code now in the applications. And on the VMware side, if we'd have been doing this presentation 24 months ago, we probably would have been a very different comparison. But VMware have accelerated their acquisitions and construction internally of these new management tools, many of which now have fallen into this vCenter Operations Management Suite, or vCops, which is a collection of not only monitoring, but configuration management tools, chargeback tools. It's a suite almost within a suite. It's a big set of technologies. Complex to deploy in some cases as you start to use some of the higher-end additions within that suite, but still it provides that vCenter admin now with new levels of visibility and dashboards into their virtualized infrastructure. But we'll compare and contrast how that matches up with Ops Manager later on. When we think about protection, yeah, we can provide solutions to protect just our virtual machines. But again, if you're deploying these workloads into private cloud environments and people are expecting you to provide them with a service, you might need a little bit more granular protection than just at the VM level. So we'll explore how DPM on the Microsoft side can provide that granular level of protection. But also VMware are now doing that stuff with their own tools. A lot of the customers I speak to who've got a VMware infrastructure, they've typically purchased a backup product from maybe their storage vendor. Maybe they're using Veeam. There's lots of other choices out there that they've embraced. But VMware now are aggressively, on a fast release cadence, bringing out new capabilities to their own backup product that's inboxed with vSphere. And that's utilizing some of the Avamar technology from EMC. So they're doing some clever stuff, and in the most recent release, now they're starting to support workload level protection inside the guests. So Exchange, SQL Server's the other one. So they're doing some clever stuff and catching up in some ways to what DPM provides. But then we think about, okay, how can I start to request stuff? So we touched on earlier the importance of self-service and using that as a consumption means for my app owners. So I work in the dev team, I need a couple of VMs, I log into App Controller, and I can see that IT has provisioned me some VMs. Great, I can use them and do what I need to do. But what if I, as IT, wanted to say, you know what, dev team or HR team or whoever, I want you to ask me when you need this stuff. And then we'll kick in with some automation to roll these new VMs out for you. And so if you need that request capability to present forms and templates to users, Service Manager on the Microsoft side within System Center, and VMware's most recent acquisition, vCloud Automation Center, which was Dynamic Ops, if anyone's aware of that product previously. And then finally, as I said before, if we want to make sure that when we're handling these requests from users, and we want to start putting out virtual machines based on those requests, we don't want to be doing it manually all the time. That's not cloud. You don't think that when somebody fires up a new virtual machine in Windows Azure, for instance, that there's somebody receiving that email to say, could you create a new VM, and they do it manually. It's not the case. It's all automated. And that's what we want to deliver with Orchestrator within System Center. And with VMware, they've also got their own orchestration engine within vSphere. However, there's also an orchestration engine within vCenter Automation Center. So you've almost got a choice now of two different runbook tools to automate certain tasks. But how do I acquire them? How do I get hold of those key components? Well, on the Microsoft side, we simplified the licensing of System Center and the key Microsoft management technologies back when we launched 2012 over a year ago. And that SKU is a single SKU. I license it on a per processor basis, and it gives me all of those System Center components. And I can install as many management servers as I need. So if I want to install 3 Operations Manager servers and 2 VMM servers, I can do that. You're really licensing on an agent basis. So by licensing the procs in the host, you can cover all of your guest workloads on there as well. And VMware took a similar approach in terms of consolidating all of this technology into a single SKU that you can then easily license, again at the host CPU level, so you don't need to worry about per VM charges. Because if you choose to buy some of those management technologies on their own, outside of this vCloud suite, some of them are actually used with per VM license charges. So as you grow, you start to pay a little bit more. So the vCloud suite certainly makes sense from that perspective, by licensing the procs and not worrying about the number of VMs. So that was just a little bit of an intro in terms of those apples to apples, as close as possible, because it doesn't line up perfectly. There's subtle differences between vCenter and VMM. There's differences in the service management, for instance, when we get higher up that stack. So it doesn't line up perfectly, but that's about as close as apples to apples as we can get. And we're going to focus on a couple of key areas as part of the session. We're going to look at how we can accelerate deployment of apps and workloads into this private cloud. So we've got our virtualized infrastructure, but now how can we do more clever things around deployment and services, introducing this notion of multi-tiered virtual machines, saving us time, saving us effort, and we'll explore some of that in a demonstration in a minute. How can we get more visibility into what we've got in the infrastructure? Deep insight, not only at the virtualization layer, which I know many of you will be interested in, but how can we help provide more insight to our application owners about their app that's running on your stuff? How can we get that very granular information? That's where we'll explore that in a bit more detail as well. We'll look at backup and key protection. We'll look at heterogeneous management. Many of you who are at the conference, you'll be running VMware in your environment, virtualizing a lot of your key workloads. But if you do want to introduce some Hyper-V, or maybe you've got alternative management tools already in your infrastructure, how do we start to glue all that together? What's VMware support for heterogeneous environments like compared with Microsoft's? And we'll start to explore that as well. We'll wrap up with a look at the different approaches to hybrid and how you can take advantage of third parties' capacity, integrating it with your VMware or your Microsoft stuff. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a bit of cost discussion, which gets interesting very quickly, because there's a vast difference in the cost structure once you start to license this stuff in certain environments. So, in terms of that applications and service deployment, I want to dive straight into a quick demo to just walk you around what I feel are some of these real strengths within the Microsoft stack around helping you deploy applications and workloads. Now, anybody who's been deploying virtual machines with VMware, you'll be using templates. You'll be using templates to speed up the deployment of your virtual machines. And you may be maintaining a big catalog of templates. You may have just a few. But in VMM, where we are now, in VMM 2012 SP1 in this case, in our library, we also have this concept of templates. Now, if you're not using VMM and you're just using Hyper-V and the interfaces in Windows Server, there's no templating. So for me, I think this is a big attractive point of going towards VMM for that more advanced way of deploying virtual machines. But you'll see in this example here, I've got two types of templates. I've got my VM template and I've got my service template. Now, VM templates are kind of like the VMware VM templates. Simple, easy to configure, but where I think you can start to see big value, certainly in deploying into private clouds, is when we start to look at the details and the granularity that we can attach to a template that's managed by VMM. So yes, we get the usual stuff around hardware config. How many virtual procs? How much memory does this have? This is important when you're deploying out in a standardized way. You're defining these templates for standardized deployment. But there's a little thing here that I think is quite useful, certainly if you're looking to try and reduce capacity usage of your templates. Because this template, this particular VM template, is using a virtual disk that's sys-prepped, and it's a dynamic disk, so it's quite small at the moment, but it's a single virtual disk. Okay, so this template is using that particular virtual disk that's highlighted in blue. But the nice thing about the templates that VMM uses is I can have lots of different templates all pointing to the same virtual disk. So if I had loads of different templates with different roles and features enabled, but they all use the same core Windows Server base image, then that's going to save me quite a lot of capacity versus having lots of virtual disks assigned to each individual template. So that's something that's pretty useful. Remember, this is a sys-prepped disk as well, so it's generalized. So whenever I deploy into my private cloud, it's already ready to go and it's unique. So it's done it in a supported fashion as well. But that's a hardware profile. And those hardware profiles can be saved individually. So I can construct almost like a sandwich, the template being the final sandwich, but I'm just putting different layers together to make the final template. So I'm going to use the hardware profile here. I'm going to use an OS profile here. So I'm combining all of these different layers to then complete and build the template. So I can save that hardware profile separately and reuse it. But if you look at the very specific stuff, when you're deploying applications and workloads into your private cloud, you're going to want to help speed up that process as much as possible. Yes, normal templates on vSphere and vCenter just deploy the VM, and then you've kind of got to do the rest of the customization yourself once deployed. But here with VMM, I can start to add specific roles and features to the guest operating system as part of the template, so that when I'm spinning out web servers time and time again for my devs or whichever group inside the private cloud, they're always going out as a standardized build, and they've all got the right roles and features that we need specifically for the application that we're going to run inside there. So it's a real head start and saves me doing it in a script after the fact. Both roles and features, so not just the roles. I can domain join, I can attach answer files, I can do all of the customization I would see in the physical world as well. And as we saw before with the hardware profile, I can save this as a guest profile. So I can start again to construct hardware profile over here for certain size VMs with the guest profile, combine them, and we've got a new template. But we're still only keeping the single virtual disk. But outside of that, this is where it starts to get specific when we start to think about applications. Because ultimately, we're deploying these virtual machines to run something functional for our teams, for our internal consumers. And VMM's got this concept of enabling you to add applications to the build, to the template. And these applications could be one of three types, or they could be a script. One of them could be to do with SQL, so we can pre-configure virtual machines in VMM to be SQL-enabled, so that as soon as it hits the wire, you've got a new SQL server ready to go. And the DAC package enables a little bit more customization of that. But I'm not sure, maybe true DBAs wouldn't use that element. They may not use the DAC package, but they would certainly benefit from the ability to quickly roll out new, fresh, specific SQL servers for their needs. So I go to the portal, I deploy a new SQL server, I'm good to go. It's accelerating how quickly we can deploy those apps. Web applications, if you're deploying websites, again, standardizing, quickly rolling those out. But here's an interesting one, the virtual application. This is using server app V. So app V, if you may be familiar on the desktop for deploying and streaming things like Office or Adobe Reader or whatever it may be. These are server applications now we can package in a bubble so that they become almost, they live in the virtual machine, they're deployed with a template, but their state and they don't run as an installed application. They run locally inside that virtual machine, but they're not installed. They're just streamed and cached, and they run there, which gives us flexibility around lifting applications up, swapping out the OS, and dropping it down later on when we're performing things like maintenance and upgrades. So our virtual applications are a powerful way of packaging maybe your line of business applications and then rolling them out as part of these templates. So we can start to build specific templates for specific applications and workloads and quickly deploy them in a standardized way. I don't get any of that with vCenter. I get the VM templates, they're easy to use, but they're a lot more simple in terms of their granularity. You can approach it in the same way in VMM. You don't have to use the app and the SQL config and stuff, but it's up to you. It's there if you think that could accelerate what I need to do in terms of deploying new apps and stuff for my devs or my application owners or whatever it may be. But that's a regular template. Granular, nice, easy to deploy. But we can go one step further, because in 2012 in VMM, we introduced this concept of service templates. Think about some of your apps internally. How many of them exist in isolation? It's one VM to one app. Think about SharePoint. SharePoint, typically, for a production deployment, you're deploying a database tier, there's a web tier, there's an application tier, and that's going to be split across multiple VMs. So rather than deploy 3 or 4 or 5 individually isolated VMs and then work on all of the configuration and getting them hooked together, why not instead start to deploy as what's known as a service template? And in this case, I've got one here we'll call the Contoso website service template. And this one, if I open it in the designer, which is all part of VMM, this enables me to build multi-tiered services. So in this case, this is a 2-tier application, and it's got a web front end, it's got a SQL server, but it's using the same templates that we built earlier on. So we've got those building blocks, we drag them in, and we construct our services from that. So if I wanted to add another web front end, for instance, drag it onto the canvas, it automatically hooks it up. The templates are all individually configured prior, because we're using them perhaps for other things as well, and we've hooked them all to the same network automatically. And I can start to do some customization of these, such as determining things like scale-out rules. So for instance, you'll see down here, this particular tier, I've selected the web tier at this point, can be scaled out. So when you deploy initially, it'll deploy all 3 VMs at once, and then I can choose, you know what? If my web front end is getting hammered, maybe I need to scale it out, I can add additional instances, and VMM will automatically take care of deploying those new virtual machine instances to the service. And the nice thing is about these services is it's not just about deploying them. It's the ongoing life of the service as well. So for instance, when I deploy a service from VMM, Ops Manager will pick it up and monitor it as a service, as a set of related virtual machines and instances. Service Manager will start to provide change management on the whole service, not just individual bits of it, individual VMs, as you would see it in the VMware world. Did you have a question there?
Further orchestrate that so that if I'm seeing capacity requirements or I need additional performance,
Great question. Yes, great question. So the question was, could I orchestrate that? Absolutely. VMM, everything you do in VMM can be done through PowerShell. But that aside, if I've set up this template in such a way that I enable that tiering, if I was using a monitoring tool, say Ops Manager, and I could be monitoring the service, the web front ends, for getting traffic, and if it gets over a certain threshold that you define and say, if it hits 70%, we need to add additional scale. Then that could fire off an orchestrator runbook, which could automatically tick that little box down there and say, scale this up. And it would add an additional instance automatically. And on the contrary to that, I could be monitoring if the threshold goes below 30%, you think things are quiet, it could also auto decommission in the same way. So it's great. It wouldn't do it by default. You'd need the runbook to power that, but you could very easily do that with the System Center components. So that enables me to scale very quickly, very easily, when I'm deploying my workloads into clouds. So when we're moving away from just deploying individual VMs very manually and starting to move towards delivering services to the business in an automated fashion. So while that's doing that, let me go back to my VMM, because I've said this is about clouds. So how do I start to deploy clouds in VMM? Well, if I go to my VMM server again, and I go back to my VMs and services, if only there was a Create Cloud button that would just do all of this for me. And thankfully with VMM there is. So I can click my Create Cloud button. If only it was this easy in the real world. I'll call this one TechEd Cloud. We'll go next. And a cloud, I've been asked questions over the course of this week around VMware's resource pools, and how you aggregate stuff together in a VMware world. This is probably as close as you'll get to a vSphere type resource pool experience if you're used to that in your environment. Because what we're doing here is we're saying, you know what, this cloud is going to utilize hosts that are in these groups. So I could be very specific about which hosts are used to power this cloud. And you'll notice there's actually a direct link to VMware resource pools at the bottom there. But we'll touch on what that's all about a bit later on. We'll go next, and we'll define some networks that are going to be used for this cloud. So I'll just choose VMLAN as one of mine. There's been loads of stuff on network virtualization, so I'll assume you're experts by now on network virt. So that's just allowing me to say, you know what, this cloud, any VMs that get deployed in there, they're going to use this network. Do I want to use a load balancer for VMs in this cloud? So VMM aggregates and integrates with load balancers, both Microsoft, F5, other load balancers that are out there. NetScaler is another good example. I'm not going to choose that, and therefore I'm not going to put any virtual IP templates. Do I want to use any port classifications? So this is enabling me to specify certain NIC characteristics for when I'm deploying virtual machines in the environment. This is basically me saying, you know what, any VMs that go into the cloud can use anything I choose here, but they may not, they don't have to explicitly. So I'm going to go next. Do I need any storage for the cloud? Probably, yes. And when it comes to library, do I want to enable people to store any of their objects, their virtual machines, their templates and stuff? I'm not going to do that for now. But now we think about the resources. How am I defining the resources for my private cloud, for my organizational users to access? And that's where I start to define these limits here. So I'm going to untick all of these use maximums because I want to give a slice of my infrastructure to these different groups, in this case the TechEd group that I've defined. So the maximum number of virtual procs in this cloud all up is going to be 10. Maximum memory, let's just say it's, 24. Maximum storage, I'm going to say 100 gig. Quota points are a unique number that VMM can use to help you organize your information, organize your usage, your capacity, but I'm going to just leave that as is for now. And then the max number of VMs, I'm going to leave that as 10 as well. And then finally, what kind of hosts are going to run in this cloud? Is it going to be Hyper-V hosts? Is it going to be ESX? Is it going to be Zen server? That's important because if you're going to be deploying VMs later on into this cloud environment, you may want to put certain VMs on certain hypervisors because you can have a cloud at this level that abstracts all of that hypervisor stuff away. So when users are deploying VMs, they don't need to know whether they're deploying to an ESX, a Hyper-V, or a Zen server host. VMM takes care of all of that, but you need to make sure that the cloud they're using is suitable. I'm going to choose just Hyper-V for now. And we'll go finish, and that cloud's created. A couple of clicks, let it finish. There we go, so there's our TechEd cloud. And I can assign that to a certain group within my environment. So I can say, OK, I'm going to delegate this cloud and access to this cloud to a certain set of users within our infrastructure. And I've got a dev team here that I've created in VMM. So it's just a role, an account, effectively. There's members are, in this case, just contoso /dev. and I'm going to give them access to the TechEd cloud that we just created. And of the capacity, I'm going to say, you know what, you can have specific capacity on both a group level and a member level. So individuals can only use a certain slice, even more granularly. Networking's fine. Resources. So this is where we say, you know what, dev team, I've built 5 templates for you. They're in there, so when you log into the portal, they're the ones you're going to be able to see and use. So all of this is really simple and easy stuff to configure at the back end from your point, but what you're providing essentially is an IaaS front end for your end users now. So if I log into App Controller, which is our self-service portal we touched on earlier, so it will be that competitive angle with vCloud Director. I'll log in as contoso/dev, secure password, and once we're in, I'll only see what I'm allowed to see from the IT guys. So you'll see I should just see my one virtual machine manager cloud. I've no access to any public clouds. So when we touch on the hybrid stuff later on in the session, App Controller is a great way for you to present not only your private cloud stuff, but stuff that's running in perhaps Windows Azure or in a service provider's data center. So hosted clouds, public clouds, and in this case, virtual machine manager clouds. If we explore our clouds, there we go, there's our TechEd cloud, we've got our capacity, and when I choose to deploy, all I can choose from in terms of templates will be the ones that we've added to that list. And there you go, the web server, the website template, SQL Server template, both VMs and service templates I've defined in here. So now I can customize as an end user and quickly deploy those into the infrastructure. So that, for me, it's a really quick look at just how you can get going with the private cloud with Microsoft technologies. But what it highlights is, actually, it's quite simple to get there. It's VMM, it's App Controller, and that's giving me that self-service element of consuming those resources and easily defining them in VMM in the first place. But as we said before, what if I want to start to request infrastructure? What if I want to say, you know what, I'd like to request a cloud to be built for me, so I'll go to a certain portal and do that. And that's where Service Manager comes in, which is an ITIL-aligned service management technology that enables me as the IT admin to set up customized forms that ask for data, ask for information from your application owners, who when they say, I would like a VM of this size, of this capacity, or I would like a cloud like this, submit, and when you approve it, the automation engine kicks in and builds that in VMM. But it's a great portal, so that's the key thing. It's a pre-built Silverlight-based portal built in SharePoint that effectively allows you to present your infrastructure users with a choice, a catalog, a menu of stuff that they can consume from you as services. So you'll see here, in terms of integration, it's easy for me to plug Service Manager in with VMM, with Ops Manager, with Orchestrator, easy to get going, populates that CMDB very quickly, and if we go back, once all of that is populated, I can log in, and based on who I am, I'll only see the pertinent requests that I should be able to make. So for instance, if I'm in the dev team, I might not see all of the connectivity options here. I might just see stuff to do with dev and data center consumption. So when I log in, I only get a subset of the choices that might be available to the administrators when they log in. When we think about, finally, BI, and we think about how I can report on all of this back to the business, it's all built into Service Manager. But how do I get going quickly? How do I build those forms? How do I build all of that automation and stuff? Download Service Manager, download VMM, download Orchestrator, so download all the bits, install, and then on the back of that, you download the free Cloud Service Process Pack. So you download it, it installs, it integrates with Service Manager, so it builds the predefined forms for you for things like, I'd like to create a cloud, I'd like to request a cloud, or request a new VM, or increase capacity for my cloud. So we're providing you as much kind of leg up work done for you as we possibly can, which is different in the VMware world, where you've got to build all of this stuff yourself. Have you got a question there? How does this compare to the Azure Pack? Good question. So the Windows Azure Pack would be a slightly different approach that you would install in the environment. It would give you some of the capabilities to deploy those services. It wouldn't use the same kind of service templates that VMM is using that we've talked about, but they would be similar. So the Windows Azure Pack gives you that Windows Azure experience, but doesn't give you as granular control over some of these options that you could use in for instance, the Service Manager elements as well. And don't forget, the Service Manager itself isn't just about VMs. It's also about, I've forgotten my password as a user, I've got a broken printer. So it's a full ticketing solution outside of just this very focused example that we're talking about. So yeah. That they would be very similar in certain ways, but this would offer more granularity in terms of customization as well. So you import the pack. It gives you the service template items in Service Manager. It gives you a lot of runbooks in Orchestrator as well to effectively set you on your way with doing all of this automation of the kind of things that the users have the options for in Service Manager. So for instance, if one of the options in the portal for the user is create a cloud, it will automatically have, as part of this process pack, the runbook to create the cloud. So it will take the information from the form, feed it to VMM, create that cloud, and you're good to go. So it's certainly a great way to accelerate how quickly you could build a private cloud, including that request capability. If you're not interested in the request side of things, then you would only really need VMM and App Controller to really get going and building those clouds in the way that we just did in that short demo. So it's free to download. It supports loads of different requests in the box, and these are all customizable. So as we said before, asking for a cloud, I would like a new cloud, I'd like a new VM, I'd like to cancel a subscription, whatever it may be, they're all in the box. And you can use them as your starting point to expand still further. And we touched on Orchestrator. Orchestrator is a very easy way to start to accelerate automation within your environment without the need to do too much scripting. That's very different from the vCenter Orchestrator, and if anyone's had experience with it, it's a little bit more complex. They take a similar approach in terms of that drag and drop approach to building the runbooks, but there's a little bit more scripting required up front with the vCenter Orchestrator. Whereas with our Orchestrator, we're trying to reduce that. We're trying to make it simple for you to join these steps together to build powerful workflow, but without that need to script too much. Remember, the Cloud Services Process Pack will get you started considerably on that kind of runbook and that automation path. But the beauty of Orchestrator over the vCenter Orchestrator product is just the sheer number of plugins. Orchestrator, we position it in a very specific way. It's for automating stuff. But then we generalize at the end and say, well, it's not just about automating and integrating Microsoft stuff, because there are integration packs, these things down the right-hand side of the screen that you may see. They're integration packs for all sorts of other third-party technology as well, outside of just Microsoft stuff. So for instance, if I wanted to automate some vSphere stuff, a vMotion or a creation of a new VM on vSphere, then there's the vSphere integration pack on the right-hand side there that I can download and I can utilize. But if I want to plug in my Service Manager tool with another monitoring tool that's non-Microsoft, but you've not been able to make them integrate natively at their own levels, Orchestrator could be that gel in between those two things. So it can help you automate and interconnect disparate systems, which is very, very useful in a heterogeneous environment. But it is completely extensible. If there's not an integration pack that exists for a product or a technology that you're using in your environment, you could build it, or you could work with a partner like Kelverian who would build integration packs for you. So they help you to gel together these different products and start to build automation between them. So when we start to compare some of this stuff and what VMware can do, can you request private cloud resources with a centralized CMDB on VMware? No. With the vCloud Automation Center, you can request certain things, but there's no integration with any form of CMDB. So if you're using this in isolation outside of your existing ticketing system, or you've not got a ticketing system, then it's going to be fine. The VMware solution with vCAC is going to be okay. But with Microsoft, with that Service Manager element, it's giving you a full service desk solution as well as the ability to integrate that Cloud Services Process Pack and start to provide that level of service management. When we think about the self-service, the role-based, we saw that in App Controller. That's fundamental. It's very, very ingrained in vSphere. The number of roles and the user roles you can define in vSphere, very, very granular. There's no complaints there. But when we think about the templates, VMware's templates are fine. They're great. They're easy. They speed up the deployment of your virtualized infrastructure. But where we can go with VMM is that next level down in granularity, not only on individual VMs, but the service templates. Now, with VMware, you can get that level of multi-tiered service templates. It's just not in vSphere. It's within the vCloud suite with vFabric Application Director. You may have heard of it. vFabric Application Director on the VMware side is a separate SKU, a separate product that effectively does that similar kind of service template approach like VMM. So it's not core in vCenter, but it's there. However, be careful, because the version of vFabric Application Director that you get with the vCloud suite is, as the notes suggest in here, it's the one for provisioning. So I can provision these multi-tiered templates into my vSphere environment, but I can't manage it on a release cycle. So if I wanted to apply updates to that particular service template and orchestrate the upgrading of all of the tiers, VMM takes care of that, but the vFabric Application Director for provisioning SKU doesn't. You need the one for release management, and that's not included in the vCloud suite. So that would be an extra purchase if you wanted to maintain those service templates going forward. And when we think about heterogeneous clouds, we're going to touch on that a bit more later on. But those clouds, you saw an indicator earlier on when we were building the cloud. I could have ticked Hyper-V, ESX, Zen Server. So we're able to deploy those templates that we define across the multiple clouds. And like I say, we'll explore that in a bit more detail later on. But how do we start to get a bit more insight and information and remediation guidance? Well, in the Microsoft world, many of you will be familiar with OpsMan. And OpsMan provides that level of depth and insight into our infrastructure so we can have the visibility and make better decisions. And it's not just about the visibility at the OS level, the Windows Server OS level, but through our management pack framework, we're able to pull in information and metrics about third-party stuff as well. So if you've got NetApp storage or you've got HP hardware, they've got packs that you can import into OpsMan to help you understand exactly and monitor what's going on in those environments and help you build a bigger picture of the whole of your infrastructure and how it relates to performance and health. But if we look at some of my alerts in my environment, obviously I keep a number of alerts in there for demonstration purposes. It's not that I'm a bad administrator not looking after my systems. But here we go. One straight away, WSUS. That's a specific alert around a workload within could be in a VM, could be physical, doesn't really matter at this stage. When I click on that particular alert, I'm getting information about or context-sensitive choices down the right-hand side here that relate to that particular workload. Check the health of WSUS, clean up, start the service, stop the service. And that's reflective of how Operations Manager tries in general to help you streamline the task and management of these alerts and problems. But if I click into this particular alert and open it in a bit more detail, in the Health Explorer, we'll see we get a very drilled down view of what's going on in the environment, particularly around WSUS in this example, and we'll see that there's a couple of issues. The catalog isn't synchronized. That's a problem, but it's giving me information about what could cause that, how I can resolve that. And if I look at the silent clients, I'm getting issues that clients aren't connecting back to base. Again, something I should be exploring, but it's centralizing all of that information into one place. Now, that's just an example of WSUS. But that could be an application that you've built internally. It could be a SQL Server or an Exchange issue. It could also be something that relates to a VMware infrastructure. So with the Veeam management pack, which is a chargeable management pack, it's not one that's free, but it's a very, very powerful management pack, I can use that to monitor my vSphere infrastructure. I can view information about my alerts in this case, but also things like my clusters, my storage data stores, my hosts, all of the different components within the environment I can monitor from within Ops Manager, but now I'm monitoring a vSphere infrastructure. So if you're thinking, okay, well, I could use my vCops monitoring for VMware, or I could use System Center with the Veeam pack, they're two very viable options you could utilize for monitoring within that private cloud environment. And you'll see in this case, I've got information about my clusters, I've got information about my hosts, the top virtual machines, lots of reports that I can run to provide value back to the business as well. So I'm getting an all-round view, the deep level of insight and granularity in the rich Ops Manager experience. So it's very, very, very useful in terms of that monitoring and insight. But my Ops Manager has been significantly enhanced now to provide that overall private cloud view of not just the physical fabric from a servers, an OS, and a guest perspective, but now deep inside the network, monitoring your switches to understand where latency may be or where there may be high utilization. So we can help you build a view of not just the virtualized infrastructure, but the whole of your private cloud. So you can start to see exactly what's going on in that scaled view. So we can see our network nodes. We can see the relationship between VMs, network nodes, and physical infrastructure. So that if you're having a problem and you know that a switch has gone down, which VMs are going to be impacted by that? So we can start to see all of that information within Ops Manager now and understand, as I said, that network, that relationship between VM and the underlying physical infrastructure. And this has been revved and improved still further in Ops Manager in 2012 R2, which is, your preview will be available towards the end of the month. And then we start to see a little bit more knowledge about when we explore individual nodes, network nodes, information about the OS running on there, information about the Mac, the IP address settings to help us simplify the management of that as well. But it's not just about the infrastructure. If you're providing a service within the private cloud, so for instance, our application owners have deployed a new SharePoint from the service templates that you defined earlier, but they're experiencing a little bit of an issue. Or maybe they've deployed a line of business app and they're experiencing slow performance. How do you start that troubleshooting? Because we can say, well, the infrastructure is great, we're monitoring that with Ops Manager, but now when we start to look at the application level inside their guests and understand the problems that they're having running in your environment, we can start to monitor at the server side, the client side, and provide synthetic transactions to simulate that user's experience of the application so that you can start to understand exactly how that works and how the performance is. And then you can start to troubleshoot still further. But the key thing is, whether you're monitoring the apps that are inside the guests that your users are utilizing, or whether you're monitoring that underlying fabric, which is really your baby, it's the same tool. But with VMware, you don't get that level of granularity at the application level because they've not got the experience there. Microsoft has come from that experience platform of monitoring our applications and workloads and extended that out to third parties as well. And when we think about our devs, we created them a cloud earlier on. So they're good to go and start deploying virtual machines, and no doubt my capacity will be utilized in no time at all by our dev team. But how can I start to build a better relationship with them? How can I start to say, you know what? If you come to me and say your app is running slowly, I can check certain things. Well, the network looks fine in OpsMan. Everything's green. Green is good. The code that you sent me, that passed the testing. There's no issues with the code there. And the servers that are powering your apps, they're all good as well. So again, that unified view within the monitoring stack of all of those different bits. So far, we're fine. But the dev and the application user still think the application is running slowly, which is a difficult thing to troubleshoot. But then when we start to look at some of the other ways that Ops Manager presents its information, we can see that, oh, well, server side thinks it's running fine, it's functioning, everything's healthy. But on the client side, there's an issue. And we can start to drill in and understand that within that application, within Ops Manager, we can start to see where the latencies are, where the challenges are, and drill down into the stack of that application and pass that back to the dev team to have that remediated. And that's allowing us to be very granular, but utilizing that same tool. So not additional technology just for management. And we don't get that with vCops. We don't get that tie-in and that deep level of granularity. And we enhanced this still further in 2012 in SP1. Back at MMS, back in April of this year, we started to talk about our new service called GSM, Global Service Monitor, which for you and I, as infrastructure guys, we're focused on the fabric, it's probably not that interesting. But for the people who are utilizing your cloud and want visibility of their apps in your environment, then that's going to be important. Because what they want to understand is, you know, if things are going wrong, we can troubleshoot, and we've talked about how we can do that. But what if people are accessing my apps that I'm running on your stuff from global locations? How can I start to understand the level of performance that they're experiencing? So my devs can define web tests in Visual Studio, pass them to OpsMan. OpsMan sends that web test up to the global service monitor that's running in 16 points of presence around the globe, so Microsoft Azure-based services, and they'll push that up on a schedule, and that will then test the app that's running in your private cloud. So it's giving you that insight into that outside-in monitoring from those distant locations. Again, VMware doesn't have that scale. They don't have the 16 points of presence around the globe. They've not got that Azure-like infrastructure to enable services like that that can be beneficial to customers running System Center. And if there's a problem detected with the app from one of the locations around the world, then that's fed back into Ops Manager, and you can pass that on to the dev team. So you're really starting to provide a level of service from your cloud that's reliable, it's robust, but it's insightful as well. And they can see that not just in Ops Manager. You don't have to say, you know what, go to Ops Manager, interpret the information for yourself. You're piping it into Visual Studio. So it's appearing as a work item in their queue that they understand. All right, I need to do this work. I know the stack trace because it's been fed to me by Ops Manager of where this application is having the problem. So it's that depth and insight that we're building into the products to help you who are providing that private cloud compete more effectively and provide a better level of service. And again, with VMware, the integration just isn't there. And when we think about integration with that dev experience, that DevOps, VMware had a great product called Lab Manager. VMware Lab Manager enabled you to deploy an environment using that vSphere fabric that you've got that users could utilize and deploy for their development needs. It didn't integrate with any dev tool or any IDE specifically, but it was a great tool for the devs to use to snapshot, to log in, to access their virtual workloads in isolation. but it was end of life not that long ago. In fact, you can no longer buy it, but they've just extended support very recently. So maybe customers are still using it fairly aggressively. But with Microsoft, it's Visual Studio. And it's the integration between Visual Studio and VMM. So VMM is managing your Hyper-V stuff. TFS is integrated there. And the test and lab manager that the client uses on their machine, so the dev, integrates with TFS. So what you're providing to them is an ability to hook in directly to your virtual infrastructure. So they're establishing their own environment. So they create the new environment. It's hooked into VMM. They're presented with the templates that you've defined. And they can go through simple wizards now to actually just spin out new virtual machines. So this is a slightly different angle from what we talked about before, where we said, well, you could request it with Service Manager. You could consume it with App Controller. That's one way to do it. This is another way to do it, specifically for the devs. And the reason this is applicable to the devs is because it's integrated more closely with their development environment, TFS and the test and lab manager tools. But you could do it either way. But with VMware, you don't have that level of integration with any form of IDE-type environment, like a development environment like Visual Studio, for instance. So again, they're choosing the templates, they're adding it to their environment, they can customize, they can snapshot, which is very important for their Visual Studio and their usage. And the beauty of this is they could have a selection of VMs and they could run a snapshot across all of them because they've just detected a bug. And then all of the other devs in that team could hook into TFS and get access to those snapshots and start to debug that particular problem. But because of that integration, it's all centralized in with TFS, so very, very useful. And before long, they can connect and they can start to utilize their virtual machines. And this just takes you through a quick look. And then the final area, again, going on to that experience, I want to make sure that my stuff is configured optimally. If I'm building a private cloud, it needs to be resilient, it needs to be efficient, it needs to be configured correctly. An Advisor, another free cloud service, I can run the Advisor agent on my infrastructure, both physical and virtual. So this is really useful not only for a Microsoft environment, but inside your guests in a VMware environment if you're using that. So if you did go with a vCloud and you're running stuff inside your guests, you'd want to make sure that they're configured correctly for the workload specifically. So this is really useful because Advisor provides configuration guidance based on thousands of hours of best practices and customer support engagement between Microsoft and our customers. So it builds all that in and provides specific guidance around particular workloads. So it might be that there's a SQL server, in this case, database present without a clean consistency check, or there's an update that we know we've pushed out that you've not applied, but we know it can impact performance and improve performance of a particular application. So there's all sorts of configuration guidance, and it's free. So it's very, very useful on that front. So when we look and compare with VMware and what they're doing, they can now monitor non-virtualized stuff. So that's another beauty of Ops Manager. It's not just about the virtualized infrastructure. It's monitoring the physical elements, the servers, the storage, the stuff that's not even part of the cloud, part of that private cloud. VMware, yes, they're getting there now, but you would need to start to license the technologies outside of the vCloud suite, because the vCloud suite is really focused on cloud. It's focused on virtualization. So if you've got physical stuff over here, hosts, whatever it may be, just regular physical workloads, then you're going to need additional licenses on top of the vCloud suite. And it may be that some of those are all licensed individually. When we think about the remediation, we saw when I brought up that WSUS alert, it was looking and telling me, this is what could have caused that. This is some real deep information on what you could do to fix that. Here's a specific guide or a link off to TechNet. VMware don't have that experience and don't provide that in the box. So there's an element of, if you're using the vCOP suite, you're going to have to remediate and understand that from your own knowledge. So it's something to be aware of. Don't have the outside-in monitoring that things like GSM provides and the Advisor. And that dev tools, whilst the dev tool they had was great, Lab Manager, because that's now end of life and you can't buy it anymore, customers are being encouraged to go to vCloud Director for their lab needs. But it seems a bit of a square peg and a round hole type scenario because it's not the ideal scenario for a dev team specifically. And yeah, we talked about the app controller combination with Service Manager before. That's a solution similar to the vCloud Director solution. But the TFS, the integration with Team Foundation Server, is a true dev integration service that we offer. So when we think about protection, when we think about DPM and what it provides, DPM's been around for a while, since 2006, but it's evolved release on release to support more stuff. When we think about protecting our key workloads in the cloud and what VMware offer in the vCloud and what we offer in the Microsoft private cloud, DPM offers that advantage of that granular workload protection. So protecting things like Exchange and SQL Server and SharePoint, as it knows how to, at their workload-specific level, to protect them up to every 15 minutes, just the delta changes to disk or to tape. So some organizations still rely on tape for that long-term archiving. And if that's the case, then DPM is going to fit that bill and provide you that integration with that tape system. And when you plug it into Ops Manager, you get the visibility of everything that's going on in your backup environment as well. So whether, as I said, it's disk, it's tape, but more and more organizations now are thinking, you know what, tape's maybe not the solution I want to go with going forward. Maybe I want to think about instead taking advantage of some of the cloud services that are out there that I could harness for my long-term archiving and storage. And that's where DPM plugs straight into Azure with the Azure little installer agent that you pop onto the DPM server, and now my backups that I'm taking of my private cloud stuff, workloads, VMs, whatever it may be, straight to disk, and then from disk to Azure, if you want to do it that way. It can also protect another DPM site. So for instance, if I've got my primary cloud, I've got my primary infrastructure, I'm protecting it with DPM, I could have another DPM on another site and point it at the first DPM and back up using DPM to DPM for DR. It's an interesting solution, it's low cost, but bearing in mind what's on the horizon now with things like Hyper-V Replica being part of Windows Server 2012, combine that with the Windows Azure Recovery Manager, Hyper-V Recovery Manager, that would orchestrate the failover between sites, and you've got something that's a little bit more dynamic, a little bit quicker if you did need to fail over your workloads to a second site. So that's a key difference there. Failover between sites using Hyper-V Replica and Azure Recovery Manager versus backing up and restoring to a second site, which could be very time-consuming if you've got a lot of information and stuff. So something to be aware of. When we think about VMs, DPM is very clever about how it manages and protects virtual machines. So after that initial replica, it's understanding all of the change blocks and just snapshotting those and backing those up at the appropriate time, at the appropriate interval. And they saw a huge improvement in DPM 2012 and SP1 and managing and protecting Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. So great performance now for protecting virtual machines on Hyper-V. But in terms of performance, optimized, removing things like page files, it should have been in there earlier in DPM. In terms of protecting and excluding stuff, why back up the page file? It's not the thing you want to. You consume a lot of disk space as a result of that. But within VMs, I could back up a whole VM and restore an individual item. Useful for just that extraction if I need to access a certain file that's been stored in a virtual machine that I've now lost, for instance. It supports SMB shares that were introduced in 2012 and Hyper-V for storing your virtual machine. So it's aware of all of the different connotations associated with Hyper-V VMs, especially moving them around. So when I'm moving VMs around or infrastructure, maybe dynamically, automatically, maybe I'm doing it manually, DPM needs to keep a track on where all of this stuff is. And so it's live migration aware. It understands and can protect those virtual machines, even as they're live migrating. And as we said, I can back up to cloud. Would I be backing up all my VMs to cloud? Maybe. Might be quite a lot of capacity. Obviously, I pay for my storage use in Azure, so it's a consideration, but it's something that you can do if you want to. You may just choose to back up your workload data to the cloud. But when we start to compare that with VMware, as I said at the start, their workload protection is now starting to increase. A while ago, it was their vSphere data protection just did the VM. It does to disk. It won't back up to tape. So if that's in your list of things, you wouldn't be able to use that. But it will back up the VM. And it does a pretty good job, inline deduplication, using the Avamar technology. So it's a pretty efficient backup technology. And it's in the box in vSphere. However, if you want to start protecting your workloads on top, things like SQL, things like Exchange, now there's a vSphere Data Protection Advanced Edition, which isn't part of the vCloud suite, so it would be separate, but it does offer granular workload protection for Exchange and SQL Server. So there's a couple of extra workloads that DPM protects, but DPM, on the other hand, doesn't have any inline dedupe. So there's an advantage on the VMware side there. So, pros and cons for both. But DPM will protect stuff that's not just virtualized, whereas VMware is very focused, inevitably, on virtualization. So if you've got stuff that you want to protect as well as more of a centralized backup strategy, DPM could be a good fit for that, whereas the VMware one will be very focused on the virtualization specifically. And the DR, both platforms, both parties now have a solution for DR. VMware for a long time have had SRM, Site Recovery Manager. Failover between sites, you've got all the replication of your VMs from A to B. Powerful solution, pretty mature now as well. With Microsoft, with Hyper-V, I could use that DPM to DPM for DR, but it would be a a restoration, which would be time-consuming, or I could use Replica with the Hyper-V Recovery Manager running in Azure to fail over all my VMs from A to B. So you've got options. There's lots of options there to help you protect your key stuff within your cloud environment. When we think about that cloud, Microsoft's done a huge amount of work to help embrace heterogeneous environments, because it's not just about running pure Microsoft stuff in an infrastructure. If you've got VMware, you might have Hyper-V, you might have some Zen server. You could also have different management tools, and we touched on how Orchestrator earlier on could provide value for that. But VMM as a tool to help you start to manage a mixed infrastructure is very, very useful. But there's often a misconception of, could VMM replace vCenter to manage my vSphere stuff? Because it does loads of cool stuff for Hyper-V. Can it do that for VMware without vCenter? And the answer is no. And is it aiming to replace every function that vCenter provides? No. It's aiming to provide the day-to-day management of a mixed infrastructure running on vSphere, for instance. So just to show you the process of me getting going, I add my vCenter server or vCenter servers into VMM. So I'll specify the particular computer name that I want to bring in, or the IP. So I'm going to go, oops, 02. And I'll give an account. So I just need some vCenter credentials that I would log into vCenter with. So this is not host credentials at this stage. So I'll go OK. And it should go off and find the certificate. So it's going to enable secure communication. And we're going to import. So what we're essentially doing there, in just a couple of clicks, is we're saying, OK, let's get VMM talking to vCenter. Because at that point, we're then going to start pulling the strings on vCenter. Good question. Is that the vCenter for Windows, or is that the vCenter appliance? I haven't tested it for the appliance, but I'd have to check specifically whether that would be supported. This example is the vCenter for Windows, but we could check that. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I wouldn't want to give you the wrong info. But yeah, it's definitely this one is the vCenter for Windows. If the APIs were the same for vCenter, the vCenter appliance, I imagine that would work fine as well. But I'll have to check the official supported statement for it. But once I've pulled that in, all I've done really is just connected the two. I've not got this magical view now of my complete vSphere infrastructure. I need to work on that. I need to put a little bit more effort in. So I'll go to my hosts, and I'll go add resources, and this is where now I've got my ESX hosts and clusters. So now I'll bring in the specific host, and this is where I need the credentials of the host that are high enough in terms of credential level for me to bring those in specifically. It may not need to be a root account. You may have a better way of managing your security on your host versus me, who just has root for everything, but you may choose to use something else that's more appropriate. Yours may be a little bit more locked down than mine. Oh, great. That'll be the wife. Not appropriate at this time. She has no. Just wait till I get home. There we go. So there's my cluster, ESXi 1, 2, and 3. We've got our environment here. It's already established. It's going to bring in the exact hierarchy that I've found, that I've built in vSphere. But this is the nice thing is, go away, wife. This is the nice thing. And it's on the video as well. Great. She won't watch it. She's not a Hyper-V girl. No, and definitely not a vSphere girl. Keep digging. Here we go. So it's bringing in the exact hierarchy that I've got from my vSphere environment. But VMM of old, when it brought in the vCenter, it would bring in everything. And the feedback was, you know what? We want to connect to vCenter, but let us choose the specific host we want to bring in, because we might not want to bring them all into the environment. And these aren't suddenly migrating all of your vSphere hosts into VMM and vCenter's going to lose control. We're effectively looking through vCenter's eyes via VMM, but helping you view that information side by side with Hyper-V. So you aggregate all of your virtual machines into one view, and you'll see now my cluster is in. So now once it's in, you'll see it will pop up in a second, and there'll be a status message next to it saying OK limited. And it says OK limited because we haven't actually finished and finalized, and one of them isn't because I've already done that in advance earlier. But this one here, if I go into the properties and I look at the management option here, this is just me saying, you know what, for us to have full control and do all the tasks that VMM can do, the day-to-day stuff, we need to make sure we have a secure communication, and we use a certificate for that. So we go OK, and you'll see that once we've done that, it changes from OK limited to OK. And from that point forward, we're good to go. We can start deploying VMs. We can start vMotioning VMs, storage vMotioning VMs. Would I be creating distributed switches in VMM? No, not for vCenter. Would I be creating fault-tolerant VMs? No. You do those kind of things in vCenter. But will I have visibility of what you've done? If you've got a vDistributed switch, or you've got a regular switch, or you've got a fault-tolerant VM, yeah, we'll see all of that and we'll understand it. But some of those you'll go back to vCenter for. Remember, it's the day-to-day management, really, that we're aiming for. Yes? Good question. Perfect setup. Yes, you can. Absolutely. And I can bring in my templates for, let me go back to my library. I can bring in the templates that you've got already set up. So if you've built import VMware template right there, it might take a few minutes to refresh. It might not, they won't come up just yet. But I've got a couple of templates in my vSphere infrastructure that I could then import. We're not bringing them over and you suddenly lose them from vCenter again. We're just bringing over the metadata so we can see them. But now I can use the same principles I saw before, having that one VMDK with the hardware profile and the guest OS profiles. So I could maintain that same approach, single VMDK, lots of templates pointing in that one VMDK. So the ones we create here in VMM for vSphere will stay here. The ones you already had in vCenter, we'll just bring the metadata in. So, okay, so any you create new from VMM will keep on VMM's, in VMM's library specifically. So yeah, just something to be aware of. But yeah, to answer your question, absolutely. So that was just a little look. And if I go back to my VMs and services, I should have some VMs on my ESX cluster. Yes, I've got a couple running here, and I'll go right-click. In fact, I'll choose this one. Migrate virtual machine. It's going to look at the host. I probably should have done the OK test for the full management, so it might not. There we go, live. So it's triggered there. That's going to be a vMotion. We'll go next. I've got the PowerShell script under the covers if I want to use that. So what it's going to do. VMM's really good at presenting all that information if you want to use that. And we'll go move. And so that's going to trigger the vMotion even though it's on the VMware environment. So they're common day-to-day tasks that we can kind of perform from VMM. So off it goes. Will VMM recognize that you've got an SRM infrastructure? It probably won't know much about SRM, but what would that display differently in the view of the VMs? I don't think. VMM wouldn't present information about protected site or non-protected. It would just display the inventory and list of VMs, yeah. So that heterogeneous management, it's not, you maintain lots of different hardware vendors in your environment, storage, networking, servers. The hypervisor could be different. The OS, you could be running Windows, Linux, lots of different distributions and versions within those. Your management tools, you may be a system center shop. You may be a BMC or a CA. You have a mixture of tools, point solutions that you've acquired over the years to do specific jobs. And you may be running different frameworks. You may be running .NET, you may be running Java or PHP or whatever it may be for your stuff internally. There's just so much choice out there. But the beauty of tools like System Center is they're starting to gel all of this stuff together. And we just focused on an example of hypervisor management. But think back to Ops Manager, monitoring all of that hardware layer. Think about Orchestrator with the integration packs for those types of hardware vendors as well. NetApp have got a great one. Cisco have got some good stuff as well. Integration packs that allow you to automate their stuff in relation to our stuff and VMware stuff and so on. When you think about monitoring, we now monitor Linux. We now support virtualized SUSE, CentOS, Red Hat, Ubuntu. So we're really doing a much better job of providing a heterogeneous environment. But when we think about how VMware compares on that front, VMware put a little toe in the water in terms of management of Hyper-V. If you look at it, it's called the Multi-Hypervisor Manager, although it just manages Hyper-V, plugs into vCenter, but it's nowhere near as comprehensive as what VMM provides for vCenter. And the fact it's got that conversion element to it as well, really it's just okay, you tried Hyper-V, now let's get you back to vSphere type Trojan horse, if you will. But it doesn't recognize clusters, it doesn't allow you to migrate virtual machines, it doesn't recognize some of the core functionality within Hyper-V. Whereas flip it on its head, VMM's taking a great look and trying its best to manage as many things as it can within vCenter, within the VMware environment. So we're really trying to make sure that you can manage a heterogeneous environment as effectively as we can. There's going to be subtleties, and it's not going to do everything, but Microsoft's doing a better job of managing VMware than vice versa at this stage. When we think about the automation, the integration packs that are out there for Orchestrator, there's lots of them to plug in for ServiceNow, BMC, CA, HP tools, Microsoft stuff. So you can really start to build automated runbooks to automate your stuff and integrate products that you may not have been able to plug together in the past. And that's important if it's a private cloud. Everything, all of the cogs need to be oiled and working efficiently. Whereas with VMware, the automation and integration pack equivalents within vCenter Orchestrator, there's only a small number and not very many third-party ones. There's quite a few for VMware stuff like Update Manager or vSphere core features, but not many for automating on a broader infrastructure level. When we think about monitoring, the management pack framework is well understood by the industry. Most of the management packs that plug into OpsMan for monitoring are free. If you've got NetApp storage, they'll give you the pack for free. If you've got HP servers with Insight, you'll get the Insight Control Pack as part of that. There's all of those different points where you can plug in and gain visibility. But with VMware, those enterprise adapters, there's not that many there, and some of them you do have to pay for in addition. So just something to be aware of. And finally, before we look at costs, what are we doing around hybrid? You've heard a lot about it this week, so my job's been done for me pretty much in this example. The Microsoft Private Cloud on your premises. What does that consist of? Well, it could be Hyper-V, it could be a bit of vSphere in there, it could be Xen. Remember that, because VMM's managing that heterogeneous environment, so the private cloud you build on-prem with Microsoft could be only a little bit Hyper-V, a little bit vSphere, and a little bit Xen, if you wanted it to be that way. But then when you link it with another, maybe another one of your sites, maybe a service provider, it's linked by System Center, because System Center is the eyes and the ears of the infrastructure. And as we move forward into network virtualized worlds, that bridging of that gap and the ability to move workloads flexibly, just the walls just seem to drop down much more easily. So we can start to build spanned networks easily with the site-to-site VPN and the connectivity we've built into Windows Server to really enable you to scale out your capacity and utilize others' resources as necessary. But then when we think about other service providers and public cloud services like Windows Azure, System Center again is that glue. We saw a little bit of a sneak into it in App Controller before where I said I could add a public cloud there. I add my subscription, I can now create Azure virtual machines from within App Controller and have that self-service view of all of my clouds for that application owner or that administrator. So powerful stuff, and it's all with that common identity. So Active Directory is the pillar of all of this, the logins, the security, the control, the management with System Center. Simple, easy to deploy, enables us to integrate all of those different bits. Virtualization, Hyper-V. But as I said, the Microsoft Private Cloud doesn't have to be exclusively Hyper-V. If you're mixing it in with vSphere and Xen Server, that's fine. We'll manage all of that as well. And finally, the dev stuff we talked about as well with TFS. So we're integrating and providing a solution that's really aimed at enabling your users, devs being one of those important groups. But then we look at VMware, and it's a slightly different approach. vCloud on-prem, so vSphere with vCloud Directory, if you think of it in the simplest form, it's purely vSphere under there. You might think, well, that's fine. Yeah, that's what we want to go for. No problem. And you connect that to your other sites, also running vCloud Director and vSphere, with the vCloud connector. And that enables you to move templates, move virtual machines around between these clouds. Easy stuff, very, very useful. But then there's a couple of different directions you can go from there. So we could go up to VMware's new vCloud service that they've just announced, they've just started to market, and you can start to utilize that. There are vCloud providers, partners out there, a big, big number of them, that will offer you that third place, that extra site for your capacity to run your virtual workloads on. And if you're building a hybrid infrastructure, your stuff here, there's your other stuff in their cloud, you link them again by vCloud connector. So there's a common set of linking technologies. But then if you want to start to run stuff on Amazon, or if you're running it already on Hyper-V and Xen Server, then you're going to need the vCloud automation tool. So that's a different portal, a different experience. So there's just a few places you may need to jump around to manage that whole infrastructure. So it's slightly different from the System Center-centric approach. And what's important to note is not all of the building blocks that make up the cloud for monitoring, for self-service, for automation, they don't necessarily work with all of these different blocks. So for instance, VCAC may not work with certain other components like SRM, for instance. There may be certain overlaps that aren't all unified yet together, whereas with System Center, they've been built and designed and deployed in an integrated fashion. But they're just different approaches. Neither one is wrong nor right over the other. They're just different things. Obviously, a lot of customers running Amazon. With Hyper-V and with System Center, there's no solution there to put VMs on Amazon and integrate them in. You can monitor stuff on Amazon with our management pack, but there's no VM integration like there is with Azure. And if we wrap up last couple of minutes with the costs. Now, Costs can go 1,000,001 different ways, and it's a great thing to show examples of costs, but then it's also a dangerous game because you can get it picked apart. So I've tried to be very specific. I've chosen a scenario that just off the top of my head. I'll choose 500 VMs, because if you're going down to the lesser numbers of VMs, 50 VMs, 100 VMs, yes, the figures are easier to work with, but at the same time, are they the kind of environments that are going to go for a full-scale private cloud? Probably not. So you might be looking at the higher numbers of VMs to justify the comprehensive nature of the private cloud and the technologies you'd need. So I chose a 15-to-1 ratio because I thought that was fair. 15 VMs to one host. Some people do a lot less. Some people do a lot more. And with bigger hardware now, I think that's a middle ground that I chose. And that would mean for 500 VMs with a 15-to-1 ratio, that's 34 hosts. And I chose common, industry standard, 2 CPUs. I use 16 cores, but that's probably not that prevalent now. But that doesn't really matter because neither VMware nor Microsoft license on a core basis for their virtualization stuff. So 34 hosts, 2 procs. So that would be 68 procs total if you were licensing on the VMware side. Now, it says Windows Server licensing additional, because I chose to say, well, look, if I'm building a VMware infrastructure, I buy vSphere, I buy my management stuff for VMware, and then I license my guest OSs. But the guest OSs should really be the same on either side. So I chose to abstract that away. So we're assuming density and consolidation are consistently the same here on both platforms. So Windows Server would be extra. Now, if you did want to add Windows Server licensing, and let's say 2012, then you'd add 34 licenses of Windows Server Data Center Edition for that kind of consolidation ratio. So we need comprehensive management for the private cloud. That's inevitable. So on the Microsoft side, 68 processors of Hyper-V Server 2012 or 2012 R2 is free. It's no cost. It's a free download. Just like I could download the ESXi product, but obviously vSphere needs to wrap around that. So 0. And 34 licenses, which would equate to 64 procs of System Center 2012, 68 procs, sorry, there's a typo there, would be $122,000. Retail price, available on the web. So that would be, I think, open, no level. So that would be effectively as close to retail as we'll make available. So people on an EA or people who have different select agreements or whatever your purchasing plan with Microsoft is, it will be likely less than that. Okay, so that's just the base figure that I can get online. So I've tried to use retail as much as I can. So total cost, $122,000. And you've seen that all of this stuff, and we've just scratched the surface of what System Center can provide broadly today. We've looked at apps, we've looked at service delivery and management, a bit about automation, service catalog, and so on. When we look at the vSphere side of things, 68 procs of the vCloud suite, Enterprise Edition, which would match up with what System Center's providing, is around about $781,000. We'd add on vCenter, which is a little bit more, not too much. I mean, assuming you're using just one, if you were using more, then you would add more. The nice thing about VMM and the other System Center tools is because you pay for the hosts, the CPUs, and effectively the agents, the stuff you're managing, you can run as many of the server bits as you want, so you don't need to pay per instance there. So it would reduce the cost a little bit if VMware took that similar approach. So the total there, just under $800K plus SNS. And SNS could be 21%, it could be 25%. So the cost could be touching $1 million. So that's a little bit more expensive than the Microsoft solution. But that said, it's still a great solution. There's still lots of cool technology in there, lots of powerful, scalable technology. But on the management side, Microsoft's just got a couple more advantages in terms of that breadth of experience and that core product set that we've built. And don't forget that that is the VMware's cost based on the vCloud suite. Retail price, the link is where you would get it from if you wanted to check for yourself. That doesn't include some of the DevOps integration, the third-party integration, the in-guest granular management and monitoring that we can offer with Ops Manager as well. So there's little things missing here and there, but that's what would be as close to apples as we could get. So, nice horn. That's that. Hopefully you found that useful. We can't cover everything. There's loads more stuff we could have compared on, but hopefully we've taken a look at some of the stuff that I think you may find useful in your environments. The service templates, the monitoring, the remediation, the kind of things that are important for a private cloud. And the Microsoft solution offers that at a significantly lower cost. So with that, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and have a good rest of the day.